This is the Unregistered podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. This is a show about ideas, people, and behaviors that are considered inappropriate, out of bounds, or beyond the pale. The things you're not supposed to talk about if you're a school teacher, a college professor, a businessman, a politician, a parent, a neighbor, or even a podcast host. These are the things you're not supposed to say or even think if you're a good liberal, a good conservative, or a good citizen. Each week, I'll interview a person who has something bad to say. They might be a journalist or a professor. They might be a porn star or a drug dealer. They might just be an ordinary person with an ordinary job who doesn't care about the rules of polite society. I'm not interested in breaking the rules just to be a troublemaker. I'm interested in people who break the rules of conventional thought and to expand the scope of what is possible to say in our society. I'm interested in people who make me think. At Unregistered Chicago, we in attendance had the rare pleasure of witnessing two public intellectuals from radically different points of view have a discussion, perhaps a debate, about contemporary politics. And now you can too. This is my interview with Batya Ungar-Sargon and Curtis Yarvin. Thank you for that. Well, here we are with an interesting combination of people here. So Batya and I were just talking, and Curtis was in the audience listening, and I guess I just want to start by asking Curtis what he thinks.
Well, I guess I would start by saying that Carlyle was definitely not alive in 1912, but actually I think you could do fairly well in an English department by borrowing from him, since no one will have read him, and no one will be able to tell that you're stealing stuff from the past and putting a slightly new, coat of paint on it. If you have to do, I'm not recommending that anyone get a degree in English literature, but that I think you could probably get away with. I think my more general response is, and this is a response that I have to a lot of people who sort of seem to come from what you might call sort of an IDW type perspective, which is that they're in general, like I think Batya, they're sort of attached to a certain current set of values, and they have this sort of map of history which has this kind of fishhook shape where it basically goes straight toward, righteousness, and then sort of weirdly turns around and heads back toward darkness in this strange way. And I think that one of the reasons that's not sort of my map of history, and I think where that comes from often is people they combine a very acute and accurate sense of the present with remaining attached to the narrative of how we got here. And so you have this sort of straight thing that's kind of straight in the past. And if you follow sort of the let's say the standard woke narrative of today, it sort of continues going straight all the way, right? And if you imagine being an alien, sent into this world, and all you have is this material in which it goes in a straight line, it's really, it takes a while, it takes a lot of work to notice that, no, wait, it's actually going like this, right? Or even like that. And that's a project that is hard to escape from, as you spoke of it almost like escaping from cult indoctrination or something like that. And I think that's very, very right in a lot of ways. But I think it's also important to remember that when you see the sort of degree of distortion in the present, that is just almost statistically unlikely to be a new thing. And so when you're basically, taking this relatively unquestioned map of the past that you're interpreting sort of literally from the same tradition, and then you're noticing a deviation in the sort of the current era, what you're much more likely to be looking at is something that's more like that. And that you're really, really, really deeply off in your narrative of the past. And, you know, when you're sort of, actually, you know, like later in your talk, you sort of gave some hints of this. So have you read a book called The Romance of American Communism by Vivian Gornick?
No.
This was recently republished by NYRB. It came out in the 70s, and it's basically a description of growing up in essentially a red diaper baby, you know, household in the 70s. And of course, because it's written in the 70s, the author, Ms. Gornick, who basically fell out of Marxism and became, or communism, or whatever we want to call it, progressivism, let's say progressive, who fell out of progressivism, and my grandparents who were American communists always said progressive. They would never use the word communist in front of me. It wasn't because I was a blogger. It was just that was their natural habit. You know, and the word progressive, actually, interestingly enough, is even found in the Venona dispatches, which are basically you know, encrypted cables from NKVD and GRU agents in the United States.
Wow.
And going back to the Soviet Union, and when they want to indicate that someone is a fellow traveler or an ally of the party, they say progressive.
That's so interesting.
Like the word hasn't really changed since, like, you go back far enough and it's like Teddy Roosevelt, right? You know, so it's sort of a broad, you know, it's much broader in like the teens, but you don't really get it being used except as like to mean like part of the movement. You know how they said movement with a capital M in the 60s, right? And so you have this like very, very deep continuity. And one of the things that you see, for example, in the Gornick book is like cancel culture is just in full swing.
Yeah.
In the 70s in American communism, and you have a family history of this. Gornick's, I mean, this is an oral history basically, so it's like Studs Terkel style.
Right.
So it's really freaking awesome. And then you can go back even further. There's this wonderful book. Have I mentioned this to you? Bella Dodd School of Darkness.
No.
So Bella Dodd was a Brooklyn school teacher. She was Italian. My grandmother was Jewish, but they were almost the same thing, kind of in a way, in that area at that time. And so basically, they were both communist school teachers in New York City public schools. Now, Bella Dodd did somewhat better than my grandmother, at least in her party career, and rose actually to the point where she was on the U.S. Politburo. And, you know, in case you didn't know that the U.S. had a Politburo, think again. And the U.S. Politburo was led by, you know the name Earl Browder?
No.
Browder, you know Browder. So Browder was the long-term head of the CPUSA, and he was basically, well, of course he was a loyal servant of Moscow. You had to be like the Shachtmanites and Trotskyites and all these other scum, you know, Lodestonites.
Talking about my parents, man. You're right. They are scum, actually.
They're backsliding.
It's okay. They're scum.
Thank you.
No problem.
I must have misheard something there.
No problem.
But yeah, you know, so, and the party line, you know, early in the Roosevelt administration had been like these are social fascists, like we have to like, you know, the sort of the splitting the left had been the party line. And then in the mid-30s, Stalin comes out with the program with the Popular Front. And the Popular Front is basically instructing all the orthodox Marxist-Leninist parties of the world to like unite and make common cause with New Dealers and, you know, previous social fascists, et cetera, et cetera. And so Earl Browder is kind of the architect of this strategy, or the manager of this strategy in the U.S., and he's a very, not Jewish actually, very charismatic Midwestern, in case you were wondering.
Yep.
Which
was important, that he was not Jewish.
It certainly, I mean, even as late as toward the end of World War, this is something else in the comments on anti-Semitism. I saw a poll, and I really believe this from the period, if you asked Americans around like even 1945, if they like Jews or not, like 90% of them would be like, no, I don't really like Jews.
Well, especially in 1945.
Sure, but like that's a very odd thing. Like you're winning the war for
Jews.
Well, no, it's not the war for Jews, but
well, they were told they were.
Well, no, they actually weren't.
Well,
no, that was the
by
German
45.
line.
Yeah, right.
Hitler was saying it
later.
was a war about Jews.
That's right.
No, it was much later.
Later, yeah, that's
like,
right.
Actually, like, no, it's not mentioned in propaganda
you're right.
at all. And it's all about Hitler taking over the world.
Yep, totally.
Which, yeah. Well, yeah, it's a slightly less like, like the later reason we had for doing it, which wasn't the reason at the time, was the better reason. So there was that. But in any case, Bella Dodd, getting back to the story of Bella Dodd, so she's a Browderite. She's one of Browder's people on the Central Committee. And then Browder, after the war, as like Stalin goes into his Cold War strategy, he's like, no, now we're going back to being the enemy of the social fascists. He's basically like, all these New Dealers really thought during World War II that like Stalin would be the strong right arm and help him rule the world. They really believed this United Nations thing was going to work, and it just didn't. And because Stalin didn't want to be anyone's suka, I think they say in Russia. And so Browder has to get purged. And he gets purged through something called the Duclos letter, which is just like Stalin could purge someone by having a letter written in an Orthodox communist journal in Paris. So Browder has to go, and the Browderites also have to go, and the Politburo has to be cleansed of these deviationists, right? And so Bella Dodd has to be purged. And the interesting thing about the way they purge Bella Dodd is that they basically accuse her. Now, the word racist was not even used at the time. They said white chauvinist. They accused her of being racist to her Puerto Rican building superintendent in a secret kangaroo Communist Party court. So basically, this thing of like being sort of accused of this like offense against group narcissism, that has happened all over the world, all over the country now. You had to be on the Politburo for that to happen to you. And so this is a sort of deep and old tradition, and it's really. Let me give you another example, which may resonate as someone who's in English literature. So you might know the name John Dos Passos.
He's going to spend the rest of the hour showing how few books I've ever read in my entire life.
So he did this. It's okay. He did this yesterday to Ben too. Yeah.
Let me just put you at just assume I have read nothing, because I am a deeply ignorant person. So just assume I have read nothing, and I'll let you know if I have read any of the books you mentioned.
Dos Passos, the reason I mention him.
I actually have heard of him,
yes,
but
yeah, he gets assigned in high school a lot. And Dos Passos and Hemingway were good friends, and Dos Passos was one of the leading lights of the American literary left, and an amazing, writer. I mean, basically, you got to realize everyone in the 30s who was cool or talented at all was a communist.
Yes.
There are slight exceptions, very rare exceptions. I recommend a book called The Red Decade by Eugene Lyons. That's just like, these were the superior people. There's just no question about it. They were the best, right? And I'm sorry, maybe I'm parochial there, but they were the best. And they had the Jews also. And so Dos Passos, who's not a Jew, some kind of Portuguese thing, and he's friends with Hemingway. And he and Hemingway later worked for the KGB or worked for the KGB at this time or sometime, right? And I think it was the KGB, not the GRU. And they go to Spain and to see the revolution, because the revolution is just like, it's like Ukraine. It's like exactly like Ukraine. It's as cool as that, right? And so they go to Spain to see the revolution, and Hemingway is just like, oh my God, this is great. This is like, it's like bullfighting only real, whatever, right? And Dos Passos has basically the same response as Orwell. He's like, holy shit, this thing is fucked. And so Dos Passos comes home and he breaks with the party and he gets canceled. And, even at that time, so there's like a secret speech that was made by Browder to the Politburo sometime in the mid-30s.
Wait, can you spell out what it was? It was he saw carnage. He saw war.
Not just that he saw war, but he saw that there was actually something evil about his own side.
Huh?
And
which was what? Spell it out.
It was communism. It was Stalinism. It was, basically like, here you are. It's like, imagine you're a libertarian. Like the feeling of, my grandparents were Stalinists from the 30s through the 70s. They never deviated, right? And, imagine you're a libertarian. Okay, you hear that the libertarian paradise is being built in Honduras. You're just like, oh my God, Honduras. I wish I could go to Honduras. You know, say it costs like $20,000 to get a ticket to Honduras. You're just like, wow, I wish I could live in Honduras, like the libertarian paradise where we use Bitcoin all day long, right? And then you're just like, there's just like some asshole, like some like shitlib or something, is tweeting that like actually they're just killing all the Indians. You're just like, oh yeah, like that's the bitchy thing that you would say, right? But in fact, Stalin's Russia was Stalin's Russia, and like the insane shit that Orwell saw go on in Homage to Catalonia was like going on, right? And so basically as soon as the left got in power in Spain, they established the secret police state. And before they had the secret police state, they were of course like killing nuns and the usual, right? There was a real red terror there. And so Dos Passos basically sees this, and he has like a crisis of conscience, he has a crisis of faith, and breaks with the party. And the thing I was about to mention is that Browder made this speech in the mid-30s, which I think is true, and he's like, we have people at all the major publishing companies. You can't get an anti-communist book published. And that was already true at that time. Like, that's at the point where you have to find any kind of unorthodox views. You start going into like little publishers that you've never fucking heard of. Like, C.C. Appleton.
Amazing. Yeah. Right.
Western Islands, that's later, right? That's the, and so you sort of already have this grip of like cancel culture that you don't see unless you know this. So the three like books by Dos Passos after he was canceled kept writing, and he wrote this trilogy, his like most famous trilogy is like the USA trilogy written in the 20s. And he wrote this trilogy called the Washington Trilogy, one which is 3 novels, one about American communism, one about American populism, and one about American liberalism. And like the liberal one is like set in the midst of the New Deal, and it's like a roman à clef. He knew these people, right? And if you order these books, at least, well, this is true a few years ago, if you order these books on Amazon, you will get pirated OCR editions.
Wow.
And so, it's just like the sort of the roots of like what we're talking about grow just incredibly, incredibly deep. Here's another example. I think I used this on you a while ago, but maybe, people haven't heard this, which is the lineage of Barack Obama one.
Well, I've got my own lineage of Barack Obama, but go ahead. Let's hear yours.
So
CIA, but...
That's not, maybe, but it's not.
Yes. Let's hear it.
It's the same thing.
Let's hear about his communist past.
Sure. So, okay, there are some people who disagree with about this, but I think it's pretty well established who was Barack Obama's mentor and or ghostwriter. And certainly professionally associated with at an early age.
You talking about Ayers?
I'm talking about Ayers.
Yeah, okay.
So some people dispute this. There's no denying that Barack Obama came to us out of the New Left, that he's basically, he's a member of like the New Party. He was a New Leftist, totally unremarkable, normal thing to be. And of course, so was Bill Ayers. And Bill Ayers was the leader of what organization?
The Weather Underground.
The Weather Underground. And the Weather Underground was a splinter faction of what organization?
Well, they came out of, was it Yipsil originally? It was
SES. Right?
Yeah, well, okay.
Yeah,
I think there were also some Yipsilites. But Shachtmanites, yeah.
One
of the Shachtmanites.
It was SDS, though.
Okay. My parents' lineage, basically. The Trotskyists, left-wing Trotskyists.
And SDS was the youth wing of what organization?
The Labor, LID, right? Labor, what was it called?
It's a great name. It's like you should like
Labor,
like a club
Industrial, what is it?
The League for
Industrial Democracy. Yeah.
Incredibly fucking based. And that was the name of this organization that between the 20s and the 50s, I don't know, but yeah, it's sort of, the names are pretty interchangeable, but you can sort of mark, you can map things by these names. So the original name of the League for Industrial Democracy was originally founded in, I believe, 1903. And it was some of the founders' names that you might recognize are Jack London, Upton Sinclair. Now, this is 1903. There's no like Moscow Gold involved here. This is purely indigenous. You know, one of the big mistakes of American anti-communism is identifying communism as like a foreign movement. As Earl Browder said, communism is as American as apple pie. And so you had and the original name of this organization that was founded in 1903 was the Intercollegiate Socialist Society. And now we can even go back further than that, because one of the founding members of the Intercollegiate Socialist Society was a fellow named Thomas Wentworth Higginson. Now, Higginson was a Boston man. He was an essayist. You can read his essays, actually, and they sound like they've been transcribed from NPR yesterday. Like they're like completely in the sort of ruling American intellect. It reads like Andrei Codrescu or something, right? You know, and Higginson is mainly known in English departments, at least, for being the guy who discovered Emily Dickinson. And Emily Dickinson is like, hey, I'm this weirdo living in an attic. I have these poems, and he read them, and he's like, holy shit, this is amazing, right? So so this is a figure who's made a name for himself in American letters, but he's also one of the founders of the Intercollegiate Socialist Society. And you know how there's like, if there's like this sort of like Zabriskie Point, you ever see Zabriskie Point? Mm-hmm. Like there's this like little 60s like socialist meetup or whatever, and then and always when you have these like little groups, there's like some old guy in the room who's like from this like some like totally forgotten era, right? And Thomas Wentworth Higginson is that guy in 1903, and he's so old that he was involved in a previous generation
abolitionism
of American radicalism, and he was in fact a member of a group. If you thought the League for Industrial Democracy was a great name and kind of comic book, let's try the quasi-organization or group that Thomas Wentworth Higginson was part of as a young man. It was called the Secret Six. And may I tell you what the Secret Six was in the business of doing? There's a very simple answer. They were in the business of funding terrorism.
Correct.
They were terrorist funders for New England, and they were prominent New Englanders who were basically doing the equivalent of like rich Saudis sending money to Osama bin Laden. And the American terrorist that they were funding was, of course, the greatest terrorist of his, or certainly the greatest American terrorist of his era, and his name was?
John Brown.
John Brown. So, the thing is,
Yes.
here are these fucking Republicans in like the 1950s being like, we're the real America, we're the real American tradition. I'm like, no, you're not, right? Your tradition doesn't go back to John Brown. I mean, the tradition of like Ronald Reagan doesn't even like connect with the old right from before the war.
Right.
Right? This is why, and like post-war republicanism is this like entirely invented thing. I mean, like even to the point where in 1940 they run Wendell Willkie as the Republican candidate. Wendell Willkie had been a Democrat until 6 months before the election. He agreed with FDR on the major issue of the time, which was whether to start a war in Europe. And like once you have a like democratic system where basically the ruling party just is like, fuck it, and we'll like run two ruling party candidates. Like, there's a lot you have to do to get back to like calling that a democracy.
Right.
Right. And I mean, what we think of as like the administrative state, the deep state, is essentially just the like bureaucratic remains of like FDR's socialist dictatorship. It's like his personal state that became a kind of permanent bureaucracy immune to politics. I guess it's a form of checks and balances, right? But the not maybe as envisioned by the founders. And so the thing is, if you're doing like one of the things I was thinking of, do you know Chris Caldwell?
Yeah.
So if you read his latest book, basically he is very, very clear about locating the cause of wokeism in the civil rights movement and saying that basically this is a kind of a natural consequence of having a legal system that does not respect the equal protection of law. And literally, you're like...
Which was how he saw the civil rights movement? Or
Well,
what it was replacing?
No, the civil rights movement.
Right, so,
are
okay,
you familiar with the term protected class? Like, how are protected classes like the same as equal protection under law? Don't you find that like a little bit Orwellian?
No, because there was segregation before and there wasn't legally after. That's a very important...
But there's no equal protection of law, today. Okay, yes, in theory, all of these laws apply to, white people as well, and you can sue because of, you can sue Harvard for, anti-white or discrimination or something.
In theory.
But in theory, Mississippi's voting laws were, totally about illiteracy and not about disenfranchising black people, right? We can see through these things very easily, and we can see that basically by creating a system in which some people are more protected, by law than others, you've basically, this is actually the original meaning of the word privilege. It means that you have a dual track system of law. It's like in medieval England, different laws applied to nobles, clergy, and peasants. So there were many things that, would be punished very severely if a peasant did them, but maybe if a noble did them, it was just fine. Can you think of examples of that, today?
Let me try to.
I'm badgering
I want to. No. I want to see.
I love being badgered.
No.
I love it.
I want to see. So you weren't here yesterday, and so we've been talking to Curtis for a long time, and I want to see if I can distill what you've been saying down to some thesis statements, perhaps. Mm-hmm. So one that I'm hearing is that left-wing radicalism, radical left-wing politics, is number one, indigenous to America and has very long roots going all the way back to abolitionism in the 1830s. It's true, all true. Yes, I agree with this. And that what you are reacting to, the woke politics, a lot of the bad stuff in left-wing politics has very, very deep roots in American culture and politics. It goes way back, and it has ties to these wild left-wing groups like the Communist Party USA in the 1930s, and then the Secret Six in the 19th century, and all the way. Yeah.
The Puritan witch trials, when we call these things a witch
right.
trial, it's actually there's a real continuity between the Puritans and wokeism, and it runs through mainland Protestantism, and that's a continuity of tradition. So,
Well then, okay, so what I want to know is, why does that matter?
Why does that matter? That matters because if you misunderstand how we got here, you're liable to misunderstand where we are and how we can fix it. And if you imagine, you're this is a problem that started happening in 2012 or something, you might be tempted to find things that look like very easy fixes that are not, and you might be tempted into a kind of false optimism. And if you're the enemy of anything, getting to be falsely optimistic is one of the best ways to beat it, because it means that they basically underrate the problem that they're trying to solve by an enormous margin. And so it's even when you say radical left, you're basically sort of being kind of sucked into this worldview that divides the left in order to, apply no true Scotsman and similar fallacies to it. It's I was talking to a French guy once, and I'm he's a French conservative, and he was trying to explain to me how there were actually two French revolutions, and the first one was good, and the second one was bad. And I'm have you heard of Occam's razor? And there's two Russian revolutions as well. Funny how that happens. And so it's when you can pull back the camera far enough to see leftism as a single thing, rather than this sort of especially sort of what anti-communism created was this bizarre environment where, anti-communists were totally right that you're hey, wow, we had the Popular Front on. Everybody was loving Stalin. Hollywood did Mission to Moscow. Right? You could convict anyone of this.
Right.
Right. And in fact, even Alger Hiss, I think, would have basically become an he would have become a Cold Warrior, like his boss, Dean Acheson.
Yeah.
And because he didn't think he was being used by the Russians, he thought he was using the Russians.
Right.
right? He was probably authorized by FDR, and FDR loved to operate that way. And so, like, when you sort of see this as a kind of unity rather than a separation, there's a very interesting set of books that I have, which is called Who's Who of the American Left, and it was published by Western Islands Publication in 5 volumes. It was edited by Francis X. Gannon, who got a PhD in history from Georgetown, and was one of the last in the lineage of, I believe, Harry Elmer Barnes. And it was just what it says, Who's Who of the American Left, but it did not make the distinction between communist left and non-communist left at all.
Right.
And reading this book allows you to see very clearly 2 things. One is that this distinction is completely artificial and makes no sense, and like it's just a sort of weird compromise that came out of McCarthyism and the strange way that we remember our alliance with Stalin in World War II. And the other thing that you realize is that Who's Who in the American Left just is basically just Who's Who in America.
Right. So Batya's attempt to resurrect what you think is an older left of the 70s perhaps, or maybe even the 80s, but before the woke period, and I'm just giving you what I think he's saying, is an attempt to resurrect something that you wouldn't like either.
No,
that it's unitary. It's all the same.
It's an attempt to resurrect something that never
went away.
That never existed.
Okay.
And it's because the thing is that when you're basically saying we're going to resurrect the good left, you're basically reading about the past through its own eyes.
No, I don't want to resurrect any left. Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify.
I do disagree with a lot of what you said.
Do it. Let's hear it.
On other grounds. Like, I think there's a lot of games being played with arguments of definition. Like, you can say something is like something, enough like something that it's the same, right? But you have to prove that. You can't just say because they share one thing, they are the same. Like, for example, my favorite example of this is like, presumably the Nazis ate breakfast every day, right? That doesn't make us Nazis because we eat breakfast every day. But there's a lot of that going on, right? Everyone's at this, everyone's
Can I answer that really, really quickly? I think the best way to describe traditions through history is sort of a genetic view. So it's like where, not literal genes, but it's like language inheritance. It's like saying English is an Indo-European language.
Right, that's what I'm objecting to, exactly.
But English is an Indo-European language.
But for example, like to say that Barack Obama is the guy who, Bill Ayers ghost wrote his stuff, like, to me, Barack Obama is the guy who gave the banks like a $700 billion bailout and sentenced Americans to live in the streets. Like, so
not very communist.
Exactly. So it's like maybe he came from that tradition, but that to me doesn't really look at what he did. It's sort of immaterial. Same thing with saying that abolition is terrorism. Like, on the one hand, sure, it shares a lot in common with terrorism. On the other hand, the thing they were fighting was slavery, and so
he was the John Brown.
I know John Brown was. I know he actually probably was a terrorist. But the reason to say that is to get the import of the reason to compare him to Osama bin Laden. In a way that erases the crucial thing, which was what he was doing terrorism for, which, okay, we could debate whether that's different than what Osama bin Laden was trying to achieve, but I think in a way there's an attempt here to create, the communists were fighting for a more equitable society. I think they were doing it badly. I'm more in the Orwell tradition. I think they were doing it poorly, but today's woke are fighting for a less equal society. They have perverted the civil rights mission. It doesn't matter if you can find the things of the civil rights movement there to be like some this or some that. It matters that the civil rights movement under Dr. King was trying to create a more equitable society. And today they're trying to create a less equitable society with protected classes based on race, where black people get away with stuff that white people never could. Like, that's different than the vision that was so these distinctions, I think, to erase them to create a narrative, to me, you're acting like things are more similar than they are different. When you look at it for 1 second, the thing that makes them more different is morality. It's just morality. It's like, what is moral? What is the moral thing to do? And there were glimpses of today's immorality before. There were glimpses of today's morality before. But that is the standard we should be judging things on, not based on whether we can find a similar theme here or there that might be like Nazis eating breakfast.
Hold on a second. So to you, the morality of Martin Luther King and people like him on the left historically is fundamentally different than the morality of members
up some kind of a trap
of the members of the Communist Party. of Joe Stalin. The morality is fundamentally different.
Right.
That there is a radical disjuncture between the two, right?
So that's the words morality and Martin Luther King. I think in a way it's a perfect example because, what you have, when I sort of take this kind of very jaundiced, deconstructive attitude toward history, it's often like, what I want to say is that the Martin Luther King of your narrative was a very great man. I might also say to someone in the Soviet Union in 1954 that the Stalin of your narrative was a very great man. Because I can't sort of deny the concrete reality of that narrative, and basically if that's your narrative, that's great. My narrative of the Martin Luther King operation is that it was run by a guy named Stanley Levison, who had been, until '56, when really the whole wheels fell off the bus, he had actually been the chief financier of the CPUSA. Moreover, he was the guy who basically ran King's operation and wrote his speeches. And so you're basically looking at and moreover, and there's plenty of things in those speeches that could very well be interpreted as that were basically support for what we now recognize as affirmative action and protected classes and all sort of the rest of these things that go past classical liberal equality. So it's like when you basically adopt, when you sort of go past sort of the Martin Luther King of sort of media academic legend, and you look at like the Martin Luther King like the FBI saw, and one of the things that got released by mistake in a recent like Kennedy assassination drop was this FBI assessment of the King operation, which I think is worth reading for anyone interested in primary sources. You're basically like deconstructing this kind of beautiful story that tugs at your heart in this very real and very deep religious way. And like, I'm loath to sort of, I think that those are beautiful ideals, and I don't want anyone to sort of abandon the ideals, but it's like when you think of like, Stalin is supporting, supporting Stalin is supporting, the ideal of humanity. Yeah, that's the way American Stalinists thought. But then of course the people who supported Hitler wanted to make Germany a great independent nation, right? What's wrong with that?
But I think focusing on the character of Dr. King is a little bit of a dodge. Like, it happens to be before the civil rights movement, like in the South, blacks suffered under Jim Crow laws. There was legislation that prevented them from being treated equally before the law. And the civil rights movement, there was nothing else. The civil rights movement was the thing that put an end to that. Now, you might not like where that ended up, but you wouldn't rather be living in a pre-civil rights era America, would you?
Well, if you go to a pre-civil rights America, one of the things that you'd find is that you'd find in every major American city, you'd find a thriving black business district and a thriving black residential.
So you would rather live in a pre-civil rights era America with Jim Crow laws?
There's absolutely no way of going back to the past.
But I'm saying, do you think that would be preferable?
That system was very imperfect. I'm not comfortable now. And I don't think I'd be comfortable then. And no, I don't think this country has ever been well governed in any particular way. I'm just noting that basically when you say, here is the set of policies that were intended to benefit these sets of people, and then you step back and look at the places and people where, like, if you look at what has happened to the African American community in the last 60 years through the lens of statistics, through the lens simply of like your own eyes. Martin Luther King himself grew up in one of these neighborhoods. He was from Auburn Avenue in Atlanta, which is now a burned out hellhole, right? And so when you're basically like, this was a sort of TV show that was given to Americans who believed that if they voted for the TV show, they would get these positive effects. Instead, it was run by deeply cynical people who'd been involved in other deeply cynical enterprises. And if you step back and look at the objective effect of it, I'm not saying that there are, like Jim Crow was, Jim Crow is kind of fading a lot by the 60s, but like, I'm not saying that they're like, it's like when I talk about the war in the Ukraine, for example.
No. We will talk about the war in Ukraine.
No.
Let's stick with this. No. Just a second. I can say that the liberal policies, I do believe that the liberal policies that came since the 60s have immeasurably hurt the black community. I can say that. I can admit, I can acknowledge that. I totally agree with you about that. But can you not say that it was extremely important to put a legislative end to the legal discrimination against black Americans, and that, you know, maybe we did the wrong thing after that, but like that was a very important, objectively moral, good thing to have happened in this country?
You know, sure, and the like. I mean, it's sort of, it can't really be considered like when people think of themselves in this like democratic sense as like governing or ruling. Everyone is sort of taught to think in the sense of, if I were king. If I were king, you know, would Jim Crow laws for black people be the way I would do it? Absolutely not. But the thing is, in the way that actual politics works, none of us are kings. We don't get to think like kings. We basically, in as much as we have a collective effect, we have a collective effect by supporting one regime or power movement or another. And so what the civil rights movement did was basically enshrined a kind of, I mean, you know, this is kind of a tacky way to say it, but race communism, as with basically race replacing economic status as the supreme law of the land. And so you're basically, like, people did not think when they voted for civil rights. You know, I was talking to my mother about this a while ago. Of course, she was on the right side back then, right? And she said, you know, she could have said what you said. She's like, I thought we were just voting for, you know, everyone to be equal and stop worrying about race. And that's what 95% of the supporters of the civil rights movement thought. But in fact, they were voting for this immense power shift, and in fact, they were voting for both, you know, sort of the destruction of the black community that followed, and this insane system of protected classes that we have now. And so, you know, in essence, what you're looking at is you're looking at sort of democracy in terms of like public opinion, just like really being like fooled in this tremendous way that has created this like insane system that we're still struggling with the kangaroo courts of today, and that actually like completely devastated the black community, just in terms of its objective outcomes. And so, you know, could you say that, you know, it's like you see one nation conquer another nation. You're like, well, the other nation, the conquered nation, was like bad in some ways. Okay, yeah, it was bad in some ways. It lost. But like the important thing that you've seen here is you basically supported one force in conquering another. We have no way, if there hadn't been what some call a second Reconstruction, you know, if Eisenhower hadn't sent troops to Little Rock or whatever, we have no way of knowing like what those places would look like today. Like we have no way, like we can't even imagine an alternate history of that. And again, you know, like even a Southern aristocrat of the Bourbon, you know, Cavalier period would have considered the like cracker racist populism of Jim Crow like extremely tacky, right? That was not an antebellum type of perspective. And so, you know, this sort of division into like total Yankee domination or just like, you know, cracker ugliness is sort of, I think this is one of the things that we could sort of get into when you were talking about, say, European populism or whatever, because I feel like the system creates its own enemies in a way. It not only does progressivism reward certain kinds of memes within itself, it tends to amplify the ugliest things in its enemies. And so, you know, because it's writing about them, it's writing propaganda about them, right? And so, because progressivism has the sort of dominant media, you know, position in this country and has had it for, you know, close to a century, even the opponents of progressivism tend to get their ideas filtered through this system. So, you know, one example of that, you know, since we were talking about Hitler, one example of that that I like to use is there's sort of this interesting thing that everybody knows about the first half of the 20th century, but like doesn't quite see the implications of, which is that, of course, in World War I, there's all of this like fake Allied atrocity propaganda about the Germans, and the Germans are said to be behaving as Huns, and like this is a huge feature of Allied propaganda. It's almost entirely false. There's some elements of like shreds of truth.
Sure.
It's almost entirely false. In World War II, the situation is reversed. Actually, the Germans are behaving like Huns, and the State Department, like, you know, Washington literally
and the New York Times,
and the New York Times, yeah, literally covers it up.
Yep.
Right, and you're just like, well, this is insane. Number one, why would you cover up enemy atrocities during a war?
Right.
There's a very simple, practical reason for this. Number one, if the Allies come out and say, hey, there's a Holocaust going on, you know, we're really in this war not to stop the imaginary German invasion of Brazil, but we're really doing it to save the Jews, then Hitler will come out and be like, you know, guys, I've been telling you this war is about the Jews, right? You weren't listening. Listen to Roosevelt, right? That's exactly, no, it's really true. It's funny, right? It's funny, but that's how it would have gone down. And then the second thing, he would have been like, oh, it's the Allies up, the British are up to their old tricks, right? And so that's the reason why the Holocaust couldn't be mentioned as Allied propaganda. It's not because it wasn't happening. It's one of the best documented events in history. We can debate whether it's 5.5 or 6 million, but one of the best documented events in history, but they couldn't use it in the propaganda of the time because it didn't work. And it didn't work because they'd already blown this one in World War I by lying so extravagantly. Moreover, if you basically think about the German side of this, okay, you know, be German, let's imagine like a 4chan green text, like be German, you know, fight allies, listen to Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, think after war will come freedom, you know, after war comes like starvation in Weimar and all this shit.
Right.
And so you're basically saying to Germans, like, look, you're either a liberal or a Hun. You know, and, you know, at a certain point, if that message is the one that's amplified, and if being a liberal seems as unattractive as it must have seemed in Germany in 1932, like, you know, and so you're basically, like, you're amplifying the worst in your enemies. And this is something like, this is kind of, it's a cycle that sort of both sides participate in. I don't think you can deny that the voting base of Donald Trump is basically the same as the voting base of European populists, which is basically the same as the voting base of Hitler. I don't think you can deny that Hitler was a right-wing populist.
It's not where I thought you were going with that.
And so you have to so you have to recognize like the sort of the causes.
Right. Okay.
Of
So
these
let me.
evils
All
on
right.
both
All right.
sides.
Let me make a few points. The first is that the other in the for Donald Trump was not blacks. It wasn't Jews. It wasn't anyone. It was non-citizens. It was immigrants. It was non-citizens. And erasing the distinction between a citizen and a non-citizen, that is very much the kind of globalist point of view. But that's the erasure of civil rights as far as I'm concerned. If you don't have a national border, you don't have a government that you have a contract with, and so you don't have any civil rights, which is exactly what Hitler knew, because the first thing he did was take away the Jews' civil rights. You have take away their citizenship. There's no government who's answerable to you anymore. So to say that Donald Trump is like anybody who was trying to turn people on their neighbors is, I think, so unfair. Because citizenship really, really matters. None of us have protection before the law if we're not citizens of a country. That's like the only, you know, Hannah Arendt was very against the idea of human rights. She was like, the only universal human right is the right to civil rights, the right to be a citizen of a country, because it all starts from that. I think that the thing that I wanted to respond to is, as a member of the media, I cannot tell you how little power the media has right now. Like, how little respect Americans have for it. The number one outlet with the most respect is Fox News, which is a conservative outlet. We are living through the demise of the cathedral's power.
Yeah, let me answer that.
And Well, I just want to make this point that, in fight after fight, the media goes out there and says, look at Ron DeSantis's Don't Say Gay bill. It's all don't say gay. And what is he, like I said before, what does the media manage to accomplish? 56% of Democrats supported it. The American people could see right through that. They're just not buying it anymore. It's all sort of ringing really hollow. So I think that the power that's involved in these kind of structures it's just nothing compared to the power of the electorate, which has been unusually successful of late in breaking free from exactly the kinds of narratives that once used to be like they were like the habitats, right? You couldn't see outside of them. They were so totally able to construct the reality we lived in.
And so I would say that, you're kind of identifying one of the things when you see, if you look at American history across the last century, you see a pattern of persistent long-term left-wing victories with certain kind of stubborn islands of resistance on like guns, for example. But, when you see, you could have said, I think that the mistake that you're making is when you look at history, this is kind of the first right-wing movement that you support. So you could have said, for example, around 2008, that the opponents of gay marriage had won almost every election, that was almost every referendum that was held on it. It was rejected in California. It was rejected, Proposition 8. It was rejected almost everywhere by the voters. Barack Obama was even, remember when he defined that you do, right? So it seemed
communist that he was.
Yes, it seemed that he was. Oh yes, he was a communists will always tell you what they think, but especially in public speeches. But and it was kind of wonderful observing at the time because of course as a blue state person, it was just sort of incredible. It's like everyone who believed in Barack Obama knew he was lying about that. And that was really because they knew what culture he was from, right? And just this acceptance of sort of the noble lie is okay, we got to bend the arc of history, doesn't want to bend, so we got to use a crowbar, and this is the kind of, thinking that it's much smaller than we're going to, send all the kulaks to the gulag, but it's sort of coming from the same place in a way. It's coming from this kind of acceptance of conscious Machiavellianism among a dominating and elite, which is very much a minority elite. And I think that minorities, I don't think there's anything unusual about 6% of the population being in charge. I think that's completely normal. And I think it will continue indefinitely. And so, for example, with gay marriage, we basically saw, you have these kind of spasms of resistance, or going back even further, you mentioned national citizenship. There was the California proposition. They keep reusing numbers, which I don't.
What, immigration?
Immigration, the Pete Wilson one, right? Basically, California voters were like, no, actually, we're not going to have a one-party state in California. We're not going to have a great replacement in California. No, we're going to vote that basically the distinction of citizenship, as Hannah Arendt had said. I don't think Hannah Arendt was in the language of the proposition, but as Hannah Arendt had said, citizenship matters, and so therefore we're not going to fund, services for illegal immigrants and who are just being let in and just this massive rape of the law. And massive and intentional rape of the law, and this is our will. This is our democratic will as California voters. And they passed this proposition, and it was said to be the most Nazi thing ever. And this proposition then was sued, and the state of California simply declined to defend it.
Right.
And what did the voters of California do? Did they say, "My God, this is our last chance to stand up for freedom. Our rights are being taken. Where are our human rights? We have a right to rule ourselves." They're well, that kind of sucks. Went back to grilling, right? With the result that California is now this deranged one-party state. It used to be a Republican stronghold.
There's a lot of counter-examples to that. California voted against affirmative action, and so now there's no affirmative action in the UC Berkeley.
You think?
I know, I taught there. There's a lot of Asians. I can tell you, it's not like the East Coast schools.
There's a lot of affirmative action. It's just not formal.
There's still, so it's still, I've seen the numbers on this. It went down and then it kind of recovered for a while. But more importantly, like you're looking at like a lagging indicator there, because they're basically like, there would not be the sort of power to pass that today. That was 20 years ago, right? And so you were basically, and social attitudes.
No, that was back on the ballot 2 years ago.
Yeah, but the thing is, that was there was a ballot attempt to revise it, and that like failed by like small majorities. But that's sort of pushing back against the status quo. Next time it happens, it'll probably win, and it's basically consistent with people's attitudes on this subject are just like they generally accept it, and the like it's like even the last school that didn't do this was Caltech. And Caltech is even because they're just like, we're elite. We don't have to like do this race shit. Yeah. Where it's like certain elite institutions under the Nazis got slowly Nazified. And now they're like, okay, well we need more women. We need diversity, right? This attitude, the social attitudes that sort of sweep across are like much deeper waves than these electoral waves. Let me give you another example, which is Giuliani time in New York. Do you remember Giuliani time?
I was not yet there.
But the Giuliani.
I do know who he is.
The Republicans or the good liberal voters of New York got so fed up with public disorder that they elected a Republican. Which is insane, which is amazing, right? They're like, but the thing is, it wasn't just turncoat liberals who elected Giuliani. It was the Archie Bunker types out in Queens and Staten Island. And so they elected Giuliani. He cleaned up the streets. But the thing is, that was sort of a lag, not exactly a lagging indicator, but it was shallow. And it basically allowed New Yorkers to simply forget about the problem and forget about the sort of, like if you look at sort of the change in attitudes toward like stop and frisk policing, which is really just means we're just going to hassle black gangbanging looking kids when they're in Manhattan, and that or broken windows policing, for example, these reforms which made not only James Q. Wilson like reinvents like broken windows. He's like, this is just what everybody considered normal until 1950. Right. He's like, oh, it's my idea, right? He was original, and so it's this kind of historical larceny, for one thing, but also the shallowness of it, because in 1950 it stemmed from like deeply rooted ideas about the nature of social order. These ideas had all vanished, and so New Yorkers were like, wow, I hate this squeegee thing, let's clean up the streets, let's vote for Hitler, right? And so they vote for Giuliani, and which is kind of the closest thing they can get, and he cleans up the streets, and it's like paradise, right? And then, what happens is that basically that allows this group of like, fed up liberals to like stop worrying about this thing and stop having this intense cognitive dissonance every time they walk down some like filthy street and have this like horrible thought of what if I voted for Hitler? Like, what would Hitler do here, right? In their minds, right? So that's a very painful, unpleasant, uncomfortable thought. You can stop thinking it now, the streets are clean. So you're actually, you have an effect where your victory, far from leading for further victories, is actually destroying the thing that created the victory. Right. Moreover, a substantial component of that victory comes from these old fucking Archie Bunker types out in like Staten Island and Queens. Okay, they're still there, they're not really breeding, half of their sons are like meathead, right? And so, the strength to do that, New York is going back into like a very Dinkinsy condition, and the strength to revoke that will not be found anywhere now. So,
Lee Zeldin is neck and neck with Kathy Hochul. So New York is poised to potentially elect their first Republican governor since 2002.
That's the state, not the city, and like
right, the city, but
Lee Zeldin
Eric
clean up, like,
no. So Eric Adams was the most moderate candidate. In the race, he beat out 3 progressives.
Who worked for Giuliani, by the way. He was on his staff.
Beat out 3 progressives and got 80% of the black vote in some districts, because they are now with the Archie Bunkers. That's what the progressives have done. They've united the black community with the Archie Bunkers to want to live under the rule of law rather than under no rule of law.
Yeah,
I mean, he's not doing a great job. Yes, he's not like doing a great job, but that's what he ran on.
Yeah, that's what he ran on.
Yeah, I mean, exactly, right? But the thing is, what he's running on is sort of relative to a standard that's shifting. Eric Adams is not going to bring back stop and frisk. He's not going to bring back, broken windows. He's got a DA who's a Soros DA.
I mean, okay, all right. Let's talk about stop and frisk. It's a really important question because on the one hand, it reduced crime.
Yeah.
On the other hand, it was absolutely 100% non-constitutional. They were stopping black kids.
Because they were black.
Exactly.
Right.
So that is a real problem. That is what courts exist to adjudicate. Now, you may not agree with Judge Scheinland's decision. I think it was, debatable for sure. But that is a real conflict. It's not like that conflict doesn't exist because it reduced crime. So we have different branches to debate different things. It's definitely something we have to talk about. Broken windows had a huge cost. You had a lot of kids going away for very small things. Now, on the one hand, sure, it reduced crime. On the other hand, you had a lot of kids whose lives were ruined. These are real debates that a healthy society should be able to be engaged in. The fact that we're engaged in those debates is not an absence of democratic representation. That is democratic representation.
I think that those debates are taking place on a very narrow ground, which I think is very, very distant from reality, or from historical reality. And let me give an example of this. I have this interesting book called, I think it's The Bootleggers and Their Era, and it was written in the mid-1950s by a British crime buff about the bootlegger era, the Prohibition era in Chicago. And he opens his book in this very interesting way, where he says, you would scarcely believe it now, but as little as 20 years ago, a major Western city was divided into territories as though feudal barons ruled. And I'm reading this, of course, in the 2010s, and I'm like, well, this describes every major city in the world now. This guy actually thought of Prohibition era, gang-infested Chicago as this exception that had happened once for bizarre reasons and could never happen again. And then literally 15 years later, it's everywhere. And so, when I basically look, you sort of use this word constitutional, and I think of the Warren Court and its many interesting decisions, and I think of the attitude among progressives toward the court in the 1930s, where they, of course, called them 9 old men and so forth, and had zero respect for the Constitution, in that other sense. And so it's when I hear the word, this is unconstitutional, I'm my mind would be utterly blown had in any way anyone in the 1780s suggested, or even in the 1860s, that you basically couldn't stop someone for shambling down the street looking weird. I suspect that the young people who got stopped and frisked, had they dressed like yuppies or businessmen, would not have had a problem. And they're getting stopped for being accurately recognized as what they are, which is gangbangers, but I suspect very few sons of Ebos who, went to Harvard and work on Wall Street are getting treated in that way, or ever were. And cops can tell the difference. And so, the thing is that you're sort of, when you say unconstitutional, you're kind of, taking this sort of piece of woke dogma from the 60s, or leftist dogma from the 60s, and you're kind of saying, well, I as an American who believe in the Constitution, which I don't really, you should sort of hold this up as very, very important. And I'm well, okay, let's actually consider with some respect what were the standards of policing in Paris in 1765. How would that have been dealt with, at that time in that place? How would this issue be dealt with in Tokyo now? What about Singapore? What about Beijing? Right? And so those are sort of the standards of that are above time and place that I would use to establish that question. I would say also that being a victim of crime is a massive human rights violation. You can see that by...
And one the left doesn't recognize whatsoever.
Because
I totally agree with that.
the state has a monopoly on violence, and so any violence is committed, morally by the state. And so you're familiar with all this story of like white flight and so forth, right? Ethnic cleansing in America in the lives of those now living. We don't talk about that, as well as other issues, right? And so, you have this sort of broader, like, when you just kind of graft this narrative of like wokeness onto this kind of very uncritical narrative of the United States in the 20th century, you get this sort of weird shape because things look really beautiful in the past, and then, but it's actually just that you've only focused your accurate critical vision really on the present, and you haven't really sort of dug like deep enough into the weirdness of the past. And I think of it, if anything, it's weirder.
So wokeness is 200 years old.
Well, can I tell you this will amuse you as a doctor of English literature. I found what I believe to be, or what might be, one of the first uses of the words politically correct. Can you guess what year it would be from?
No.
I believe it was 1933. It was in an essay by Walter Benjamin. He's using correct in the 1930s sense to mean according to the party line. And he's saying, he has a very modern point. He's saying that your work cannot be politically correct. He put the accent on the stress on the first word. Work cannot be politically correct if it is not artistically correct. In other words, as an artist working for the proletarian movement, your art should not suck. Very good point. A lot of people can stand to hear that today. But he's like, it's not enough to just write this like shitty proletarian fiction, which was all the rage at that time. And yeah, I mean, one of the resources I recommend to sort of everyone who kind of wants to get us, I mean, I love reading these old like Virtue things and so forth, but it's kind of hard to like start with that. I think just immersing oneself in like the progressivism of the past is a great thing to do. Like, for example, the New Masses Archive.
Sure.
On Marxists.org, there is an entire archive of the New Masses.
Never forget that it was the World Socialist Web that took down the 1619 Project.
That's right.
Yeah, no, see, there you go. And I won't forget that. And I didn't forget that. And Ben Burgis just the other day was telling me, he was reminding me that even Nathan Robinson has done really very brave things with like the COVID lab leak. He's really stood up there, you can't, once you recognize that this is the truly elite American tradition, one of the effects that has is that you sort of realize the like aristocidal quality of any sort of desire to sort of throw it in the trash can of history. Like, you can't throw your whole elite in the trash can of history. And what sort of the McCarthyists didn't realize is that they were sort of subconsciously trying to rebel against the New Deal, but they had no idea how to throw their own elite into history. Hitler had an idea of how to throw, the elite into history. He sort of succeeded, like, locally in a way, but it was a very toxic regimen. And so the question sort of remains unanswered of like how to sort of take this very deep toxic tendency in the way our societies govern ourselves, which is really not alien to these societies. It's not something that like you can sort of cast, it's not a like recent infection or something that can be like simply cast off. And so that basically tells you that any idea from the right or the left that you can just say begone with all this woke stuff is like hopelessly superficial.
Give up, Batya. Give up.
No.
Comply? You want Batya to comply with the woke regime, which is 2 centuries old.
I want her to understand that the only way to get rid of the regime is to actually get rid of it. And so it's funny, it's like she was describing someone, there was a question on the wokeness questionnaire that's like, do you believe that America's institutions are so racist that they need to be raised and rebuilt from the ground up? And I was like, I'd probably use a different word than racist, but yeah.
Yeah.
So I might say progressive, or maybe I would come out and say communist. I think it's fair to say communist. Yeah. And with a small c rather than a big C.
So let me try something here. I want to give you time now to talk.
Well, I had a whole hour before. I'm good.
So I come from the left, very much from the left, as everyone knows, as do you, and I guess you're still a part of it. So Curtis has provided a wealth of information about how so many left-wing and liberal and progressive movements and people and ideas have been rooted in fanaticism, communism, and illiberalism. And it's very hard, he's saying, to disaggregate people like Martin Luther King from the tradition of illiberalism and fanaticism and communism. I'm not sure I agree with him entirely. I think a lot of what he's saying is correct, but I have thought for a long time, until very recently, that there were many still left-wing ideas, despite knowing much of this history myself, that were still worthy. They were still worth carrying forward. Sure. They were worth using to guide my life with, right? I want to know from you, what is it in left-wing history, liberal history, whatever you want to say about that, anything that's not right-wing, that is worthy for you? What is it that you're trying to hold on to or to amplify now from that is from the past? What in left-wing history do you find worth celebrating or putting forward?
Equality before the law, I would say. Yeah.
Equality before the law. And so what Curtis has been saying is that has never been a tradition on the left or among liberals.
So on the one hand, a part of me wants to just reject the idea of comparing things, because I think, when I was in grad school, they said there's two kinds of historians. There are those who say nothing is like anything else, and those who say everything is like everything else. And I think, like I said, I think the value of the historical perspective, it's very interesting. I'm fascinating. You're fascinating. I learned so much right now, but most of it I think is pretty irrelevant to the big questions of the day. I just think we're living in a very, specific time. I was going to say unique. Okay, you've taught me not to say unique. It could be that this has happened before, but it's just what I'm seeing right now is just huge amounts of resistance to it. Maybe that happened in the past as well. I don't know. I'm a big ignoramus. Like I said, I am so ignorant of history. But to me, what I'm seeing is just so awe-inspiring. The desire of people to have autonomy and to have self-rule, and that being reflected in, I think, huge legislative wins. I do find myself increasingly turning against things like affirmative action that I, really, really supported for many years. Reconsidering, Scheinlin's decision about stop and frisk, having talked to cops, they say that to me all the time. We can tell by the way they're walking if there's a gun. So I do find myself but on the other hand, these strict legal questions are extremely important. The way that Black Americans feel about their position in society is extremely important. The past is real. There are things that remain. Liberals are messing up how to fix those problems 100%. But I don't see the right offering alternatives that fix the things that matter to me. The question of equality before the law, equal access to the American dream, children thriving, children not being in situations where they're being abused and everybody knows it and nobody talks about it. Something like 2/3 of children are sexually abused in homes in which there's a
But what's the policy corrective that you want for that?
But I don't see anybody on the right offering the left won't talk about it because it's in minority communities and embarrasses them, but the right doesn't talk about it because they live in liberal cities. It's not my problem, and neither of those are acceptable.
No, but everybody agrees that children are being mistreated, so what's the liberal or left-wing policy corrective that you want?
Well, so like I'm saying is my questions are all still liberal questions. Uh-huh. My answers increasingly are less liberal.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just about to mention, Jack Kemp's opportunity zones.
Yeah.
You remember Jack Kemp?
Sure, of course.
There you go.
I remember the opportunity zones too.
Yeah. I would say that. Two things. One is that it's certainly interesting to watch Donald Trump appear to appeal to Black and Hispanic men because not because his policies are good for them, although maybe they are, maybe they aren't, but because he seems like a man and they want to be governed by men.
Could be.
Or ruled by men, I should say. And,
could be.
So, like, there's definitely, I would say that the reason you sort of want to understand these things historically, as Marx said, history doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme. I don't know, that may be an apocryphal Marx line, but it's a good line, and I'm stealing it. And so,
but you fundamentally don't believe that we can approach a place where where citizens are more equal before the law.
I would say even that to think in those terms is very. I would not even sort of restrict my thought about the problem to these sorts of legal truisms. I'm not that much a believer in the American spirit. What I usually say is that I think that one way to reframe, and I usually can get progressives to, Ben Burgis yesterday was agreeing with me on this, although not about Latin American history, but the mission of, and this is very unlibertarian thought, certainly, is that the mission of government is and always has been to promote what used to be called in pre-modern political thought the solus populi, the health of the public in the broadest sense. So they would say, and this is still the state motto of Missouri, they would say solus populi suprema lex, the health of the people is the supreme law. And so when we look, for example, at the decline, Thomas Carlyle, my personal guru, called this, the condition of England question. And so his point in the essay which coined that term, this is also where he coined the term dismal science. He's like, when you look at how are these people doing, like, you can't really answer that by statistics. Statistics will sort of give you some clues, but like GDP is just measuring like how much like luxury there is there. And you're really just like, are they living healthy lives? Are they living in a healthy and human way? Are they finding work that is fulfilling and like challenges their capacities? And like, is there order? Is there, and these questions are much more fundamental and important to me than these sort of, 18th century Enlightenment abstractions about equality under the law. Yeah, I believe that, certainly equality under the law is a great principle. We don't have equality under the law between Americans and Guatemalans. Guatemalans are subject to Guatemalan law. Is that a violation? Should we invade and conquer Guatemalans?
Yeah. Right.
It's like, you said what Hannah Arendt said about, citizenship, but you haven't said whether you believe in just soli or just sanguinis, whether you believe that if someone pops out a baby on American soil, that baby is an American, which is very much against the tradition of citizenship throughout history, where, nation comes from natus, meaning birth. And moreover, both of those things to the modern liberal mind seem completely exceptionable. The idea that your human rights as a person should depend on like the GPS coordinates of the like delivery room, strikes people as just like nuts. Like there's no way you could get people to take that seriously. But also like, the just sanguinis is like, that's basically the definition of racism. By like sanguinis, they mean DNA.
Right.
They mean, if you are of, a Haitian, you can never be a Norwegian, right? And so that's also unacceptable. And the only thing that's sort of acceptable when you take these liberal principles and you really apply them fully is world citizenship and global human rights, which, as you accurately point out, is basically some kind of recipe for global tyranny of a kind that we haven't seen yet. And certainly when you talk about democracy, I mean, you say, well, one party has basically been systematically winning elections over decades by basically, getting the government to not enforce its own immigration laws. You're like, wow, that's a pretty slick way of hacking democracy. I thought I would just hack the voting machines, but that's kind of cooler. And so, you're basically like, there's sort of no way out of these problems without breaking out of the sort of dimension of Enlightenment politics and basically kind of looking at modernity through genuinely pre-modern eyes. And of course, to do that, you have, I think most Americans sort of sense of history as something that is disputed and conflicted in whatever direction ends about 1960, and then before that it's all just cardboard propaganda basically. Usually the facts are true.
Okay.
But to go back and sort of resurrect that, what would Elizabeth I think about, stop and frisk, right? How would she view, well, we can read the Elizabethan Poor Law, and I think we have a pretty good idea, if we understand Elizabethan society, how they would, basically tell how, Gloriana, would tell New York to solve its problems today. It's probably not something that most New Yorkers would support, and that's just my guess. But, having, that sort of perspective that is not parochial, that is kind of cosmopolitan in time as well as space, is just I don't see how you get out of these questions, what is the nature of citizenship, without sort of breaking out of the very Truman Show-ish bubble that we kind of find ourselves in. And it's one of the patterns that I see a lot is, people are they're oh my God, I'm living in the Truman Show, how do I get out of here? And they sail you've seen the movie, they sail their boat to the edge of the sky, and the sky is made out of canvas, and there's a little door, and they step out. And what they don't realize is that there's maybe 12 of those shells, right? They've actually just stepped into
another
the
one.
Truman Show too,
Right.
And it's really very, very hard to escape from Plato's cave, because there's a bunch of easy escapes that just go into another cave.
Another cave.
And that's my somewhat cynical.
Batya has to leave in 18 minutes. Batya, do you want to respond to that and then take a couple questions?
No, let's open it up.
Okay.
We've talked a lot.
All right. Who we got here? Anyone? Adam in the back.
I wanted to re-raise a point you made in the first hour, Batya. That might be a point of agreement with you and Curtis. I'm interested to hear Curtis's perspective. You were talking about kind of the distortions in grad programs from the need to say something novel, which I would say is maybe the less bad part of that phenomenon, and that we're now at least a few generations into educating students where in your AP English class or undergrad literature, you can get an A without understanding the content of what you're reading by just making a critical analysis to say, Dickens wasn't reflecting the diversity of England at his time.
Dickens raped. He raped. He was a rapist. No.
There you go.
Probably.
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 Why are you to be able to explain how the structure of Great Expectations advances the narrative goal? I think that's done two things, one of which is we have generations of ostensibly educated people now who have difficulty appreciating great art and literature, which I would suspect would be a concern for Curtis. And second, it just reinforces this broader trend of when you hear an argument or you engage with some media, you should have this reflexive, well, who's saying that? Why are they saying it? Rather than engaging with the content itself, which I see as the less bad phenomenon. And I gotta find something new to say, but that new thing is often, reflect to criticize the author in some way rather than engage with the material.
That's for you.
Oh, I thought it was for Curtis.
No, it's for you.
Both of you.
I would say it's even worse than that, because students now are afraid of offending their, more often than not, very liberal teachers, and so they're sort of parroting what they think that they're expecting to hear. There's definitely no appreciation of the material. I guess I'm less worried about that. I feel like, it's nice to appreciate art, but it's not, I feel like, we'll survive as a society without that, but, I do find that there's something that, I don't know if this will exactly address your question, but something I've noticed is the liberal media is very angry that no one trusts them anymore. That, most Americans, 65% of Americans, 70% of Americans now, when they read an article, their first thought is, who wrote this? I wonder if I believe this, right? If it's the New York Times, forget it, right? And the media is very butthurt about this, they're really upset. But, that in and of itself is something we used to teach in school, right? To be skeptical, how to question your sources. That's just become now a normie phenomenon because the media has so beclowned themselves with their sort of deplorable behavior. And I can't help but think that's great. To me, that's there's an incredible intelligence that people are now bringing to, the media. Certainly when they disagree with it, right? Less so when they agree with it. But, a point I make in the book is that, the golden ages of American journalism, the media was not nonpartisan. It was deeply partisan. It was just partisan on behalf of the masses. So you could have a situation in New York where, in the 1920s, there were so many communist newspapers that there were 10 communist newspapers that you would never dream of opening because they're the wrong ones, and you're a communist, right? Because you have your 11th one, right? Like, it was so rich, but it was also very partisan. And today, of course, the media is partisan on behalf of the elites. You have the sort of the leftist media is for that 6%, and the right-wing media, economically at least, is much more partisan for the right. But so I think people are exercising those critical thinking skills a lot when it comes to the other side. And, once you have that skill, I think that's sort of much more important than, if you have, people are like, oh, we're in this situation where, like, we don't have a single source of media coverage anymore. There's going to be all this wrongdoing from our, elected officials and so forth. It's like, well, anytime a Republican does something wrong, the New York Times is going to call them out. And anytime a Democrat does something wrong, Fox News is going to call them out, meaning that, 100% of the wrongdoing is now being called out. So I feel a little bit less worried about that. I'm not sure if that answered your question or not.
I feel, let me answer the question. I feel a little bit more worried about it, and that's because, just to answer that in reverse, one of the many retarded things about the last election was the treatment of the Hunter Biden emails, and that was not only treated objectionably according to media standards. I once had the editor of a Condé Nast publication agree with me that was handled very badly, but it was also handled very badly on the right because the baboons who got a hold of these things were like, we have to generate media coverage, right? And so they instead of just putting it all on WikiLeaks or whatever it is now, which they should have done, they're like, we're going to dribble out stories to the New York Post. Oh no, not the Washington Post, the New York Post, right? And the thing is, the problem is that the impact of a story in the New York Post is zero. Nobody cares.
That is so not. You're such an elitist.
I know,
yes, he is. Yes, he is.
I'm actually a believer in what's called the Italian elitist school of political science.
Oh,
By the way,
that's right.
I told Bob
right.
Beef from Good Old Boys, you should all listen to the Good Old Boys podcast. It's amazing. I told him I was going to be on a panel with you, and I was like, he's such an elitist. And he said he's going to be so tickled if you call him that.
That's right.
That's right. He's great. But yeah, so if you like, the book that I always recommend is Walter Lippmann's Public Opinion from 1922, because Walter Lippmann was the premier in media intellectual of his day, and Public Opinion is this wonderful book that's basically like the public.
Let me tell them what's actually in that book. Exactly. He wanted every journalist to have a college degree. He wanted what we have today. It's the worst book.
What we have today. Oh yeah, no, and that's why it's important to read, right? And he basically was just like, no, college men, you have to be the guardian class. You have to be Plato's fucking guardian.
There it is.
And it's like when you appreciate the
But you love that.
Well, no, I love seeing the echo of it in history. I don't love, it's just sort of not done quite right. But the thing is, this is kind of this conflict between the forces of oligarchy and the forces of democracy or populism or whatever you want to call it, right? And basically, around the way this system got established is around the turn of the last century. Elites, people, university men, aristocrats, people like, Henry Adams, basically noticed that their country was run by thieves and criminals and people who lied to the public constantly, and it was the Gilded Age, and it was just these ass clowns, right, who were often criminals, and who had 40 fewer IQ points than them. Not that they knew about such things at the time, but they were just like, what the hell, could be the greatest nation in the world. Who the hell is in charge of it? These Boss Tweed type clowns. Right, now at the time, America, I would say, was governed very like China in some ways. Shit got done fast, shit got done ugly. Somebody always got paid. Shit got done, right? But the idea in 1900 of putting university professors in charge of public policy, this was oh, do they do that in Germany? That's a Bismarck thing. It was a new idea, and this idea of the press as a guardian class was also a new idea. And what was cool about it then is that these institutions had not yet been corrupted by power. So you have the question of like who guards the guardians, who watches the watchdogs, and they're like, oh, I know a really sweet dog, we'll put him in power, right? And they put this dog in power, and he just starts turning into this like nasty, horrible, like grossly obese pit bull, that we have today. But like when you realize sort of that the people who came up with this system were kind of thinking in a rational, they were responding to the problems of their day in a rational way. God only knows what they would have thought of the monster that this thing turned into. They would not recognize it in many ways, but they would basically be like, oh yeah, that's what we were trying to do, but we weren't trying to do that. Right here.
Yeah, Batya, will you just comment on what power you think the media has or doesn't have? Will you just elaborate on that more?
Yeah, it's so funny because the reason Joe Biden won was because he ignored the media and he ignored Twitter, because the media and Twitter are like the same. And then as soon as he got into office, he started paying, I think actually he probably lost a little bit of mental capacity, and the people who are in charge of him paid really close attention, and suddenly he started sort of ruling in a very different way than he had campaigned. So in that sense, the media has that power because it has the power to influence the discourse on the far left, and for politicians who are catering to that, it has a lot of power. But I think that they are very circumscribed in how far they can go with trying to implement those ideas. I think it's quite limited in terms of what it can turn into from like a real world point of view. So yeah, discursively takes up a lot of airtime, right? If you watch what's on Fox News, it's actually quite aligned with what Americans are talking about, right? Like inflation, crime, immigration, like the top ideas that Americans are worried about. If you look at what's going on in the New York Times and on CNN, it's very far from, 5 minutes, thank you.
5 minutes.
It's very far from that. So it looks like it's very powerful because it's so separate from what Americans are talking about. But I think when I look at what's happening in the real world, there's just a huge disconnect. And so they have a lot of cultural power in terms of conversation, in terms of the symbolic level. But it peters out as soon as it comes to, Kathy Hochul just rolled back half of the bail reform stuff because she knew that there was no way she was going to win unless she could distinguish herself from the progressives. That's what I'm talking about.
Interesting.
Can I answer that really briefly?
Yep.
I want to disagree a little bit. I think that most of the power is what you might call low frequency rather than high frequency power. And so, what you're really looking at is not the sort of local things where you're right, you will get sort of oversteps that are kind of pushed back a little bit, but that overstep is going to repeat itself much more firmly in 20 years or so when the kids who are like into prison abolition get into power. You haven't seen anything.
Oh.
Yet, and so the sense of that power, it's more in the style book than in the stories. Like capitalizing B for black, sort of means more than like bail reform to me. And that's an AP style book now, I believe. Do you do that at Newsweek? Do you capitalize the B? Yeah.
Wow. All right, last one right here.
Curtis, one of my favorite points that you made in a piece written a while ago was the notice in the change in the attitude towards jobs programs and how that has kind of erased from cult consciousness on the left. And I guess my real question is, do you find that FDR's openness and willingness to that, do you find that more as like a monarchical phenomenon or one of a phenomenon of the left, and what does it say that
it's a monarchical phenomenon, certainly in a way, and it also represents. I think one of the things I wanted to disagree with Batya about, but didn't find time to, is that certainly in the 20th century, the American left has always been a movement of the elites and whatever client groups they could scrape together. And so basically, the fact that a major constituency of their client groups were at the time people who did manual labor, they provided and cared for those people. As a state that is responsible for the solus populi, should they have provided and cared for those people and made sure that they didn't fucking starve? Yeah, of course.
Batya's got to go. Thank you both for a remarkable exchange. I never thought I'd see something like it. Thank you both, and thank you all for doing this. Give them a big round of applause, please. So I'm going to reconvene. This is the Unregistered Podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. To become a patron of the show and have access to bonus episodes, AMAs, and the Unreported News Analysis Show, go to patreon.com/unregistered. Thanks for listening.